As Lee entered Maryland, he envisioned a state ready to welcome his army with open arms, and even to threaten the heartland of the North, just as the Federals had repeatedly done for the previous year in Virginia and the Carolinas. However, in the intricate dance set between Generals McClellan and Lee, the former could hardly believe his luck in finding the infamous Special Order 191. The Union general's uncharacteristic aggressiveness then caught General Lee on the back foot, and he found the closest defensive position for his disjointed command, the passes of South Mountain. On September 14th, General Samuel Garland of D.H. Hill's division would rush southwest from Turner's Gap, tasked with finding defensive positions at Fox's Gap and facing off with the first elements of General Jacob Cox's division that approached the pass. Garland's North Carolinians would hold against the Ohioan regiments for a small while, though at the cost of General Garland's life. 2 James rifles of the 1st Battery of Ohio Light Artillery had run their guns up so close to the enemy that the artillerymen were butchered as they tried to man the guns. But the 30th Ohio were able to flank around the stone fence the North Carolinians were firing from and raked their lines with heavy fire as they fell in droves. The far right flank of the Confederate lines were held by the 5th Virginia Cavalry, 2 3-inch ordnance rifles of Pelham's Battery, and the 5th North Carolina Infantry. They were all that stood at Fox's Gap against a fresh set of Union troops under General George Crook, which now marched up the Loop Road and across the fields towards the beleaguered defenders. The 5th North Carolina were easily cut down in their exposed advanced position in an open field, and all along the line the Ohio regiments began to charge directly into the sparse remaining defenders along the wood road, scattering and disintegrating most of the Confederate regiments. The 5th Virginia Cavalry and the 2 guns of Pelham's Battery retreated into the woods to get away from the bayonets and enraged Ohioans who screamed in a murderous rampage behind them. The only remaining regiment of Garland's original command was the 13th North Carolina, which with the help of Bondurant's Battery as well as the 2nd and 4th North Carolinians from G.B. Anderson's command, desperately held off the Union troops at Wise's Cabin, using the stone wall around Wise's Garden as their own Alamo against the Blue Tide. They too would fall and retreat from the battlefield with Fox's Gap firmly under Union control. Farther northwest on the other side of the National Road, which was one of the oldest infrastructure projects completed by the federal government 50 years prior, was Hooker's 1st Corps, and in particular General John Hatch's division. Their attack would attempt to outflank the sparse defenders at Turner's Gap by moving farther north via the Frosttown Road, allowing them to avoid most of the Confederate firepower positioned in a crossfire against any that might attempt to push directly against Turner's Gap via the National Road. If successful, McClellan could potentially pincer D.H. Hill's lone division from 2 sides, and even cut off his escape back to Boonesboro. General John Porter Hatch had done well as a cavalry brigade commander until the Valley Campaign, where after 2 failed cavalry raids, he was transferred to commanding the 1st Corps' 1st Division of Infantry. Hatch's men had advanced directly across fields of corn and woodlands before reaching the Frosttown Road near the Daniel Rent Farm. Farther up the hill, the Virginian infantry under General Garnett awaited the Federals' arrival, and neither side could see the other until they are almost upon each other. Despite the strong Confederate position behind fence lines and woodland, the number of Union regiments allowed them to outflank and outmatch their Gray counterparts, even despite General Hatch being wounded by a shot in the leg early in the fight. His division would even manage to almost reach the summit of the mountain north of Turner's Gap. Farther south at Fox's Gap, Confederate reinforcements were finally arriving, as were the remaining elements of the Union 9th Corps, which had mistakenly headed towards Turner's Gap before being turned around by General Burnside back to Fox's Gap. By 5 o'clock, after several hours of deadly and accurate fire from Bondurant's rebel guns, 4 new brigades of Confederates had finally arrived on the old Sharpsburg Road to push back the Union 9th Corps, which gathered in strength below them. One failed offensive by General Drayton sent his men scurrying back to the protection of the stone walls, before they too collapsed from the Union onslaught. But another brigade of North Carolinians would soon have something to say. Colonel George B. Anderson's brigade had arrived late in the day, after several hours of marching in conflicting orders until they reached the wooded mountains to the south of Fox's Gap. Anderson's brigade was able to approach the flank of the 9th New Hampshire and almost capture the practically undefended Clark's Battery, but his scouts missed the approach of Fairchild's brigade of New Yorkers. So when the 2nd, 4th, and 13th North Carolina regiments advanced to take the Union guns for themselves, they were met by a devastating volley by both the 9th and 89th New York, as well as double canisters sent by Clark's Battery. Anderson's command could only scamper back up the hill in defeat as they left their dead and wounded lying on the mountainside. The 9th Corps continued to consolidate their position and control over Fox's Gap after having routed Garland, Drayton, and Anderson's brigades. The commander of the 9th Corps, General Jesse Reno, had been born originally in Wheeling, Virginia, and grew to be a military man in the same West Point class as many prominent Civil War figures, including Stonewall Jackson, George McClellan, George Pickett, and A.P. Hill. Reno had rode up to the Gap to check on his troops and congratulate them on a hard-fought victory, as well as to scout for the enemy positions. As he rode upon his horse, he spotted movement in the trees to the north of Wise's cabin on the other side of several open fields, and ordered the dual 51st Regiments of New Yorkers and Pennsylvanians to investigate, before the fire of muskets lit up the scene. General Jesse Reno, at the age of 39, was mortally wounded from the incoming fire poured into the Union ranks by elements of Hood's division. While returning fire helped to clear out the Confederate skirmishers, the damage had been done, and the fight over Fox's Gap that had gone on for almost 10 hours was finally done as daylight faded from the valley. Some 12,000 men of the 9th Corps had successfully taken their objective despite the 7,500 Confederates which had tried to defend against them. The Ripley's brigade had only managed to get lost in Pleasant Valley, while Garland and Drayton's brigade had been scattered, destroyed, and captured. Yet the loss of their beloved commander was a harsh blow that tempered their victory against the Confederacy. Slightly northeast, General McClellan was correct in his assumption that the National Road would be heavily defended. But for his other attacks to work, there still had to be some threat in the center. Thus, late in the afternoon, General Gibbons's brigade would be sent forward with 2 regiments on both sides of the National Road. Facing him would be the men of Raines's brigade, under the command of Colonel Alfred Colquitt. Including both hardy Georgians and Alabamians, their brigade was tasked with holding the southern half of Turner's Gap from the direction of the National Road to their east. They would be witness to the bravery and fortitude of their northern counterparts as they marched in ordered lines up the macadamized road towards them. Despite the stone walls, cliff faces, heavy woodland, and cannon fire which pelted the troops that General McClellan would call the Iron Brigade, the men of Gibbon's brigade would once again prove their mettle as they gradually pushed forward under the late afternoon sun. The 6th and 7th Wisconsin began to leapfrog over each other as one would lie down and reload as the other would volley fire into the woods to the north and advance. They repeated this even as the prevailing light slowly darkened in the area, plodding closer and closer towards the bright flashes of light from enemy musket fire, until 9 o'clock when the darkness prevented their moving any closer. Bayonets were fixed and sentinels posted for any possible rebel counterattack that might occur during the night, but none would arrive. General Lee had instead sent the general call for retreat, and the Confederate Army quietly returned to Boonesboro, and then across the Antietam to the town of Sharpsburg. There they would find what rest they could as the Federals awakened and cautiously approached Turner's Gap, only to find it vacated. By September 16th, General McClellan and the Army of the Potomac reached the Antietam Creek as well and prepared for the battle to come. The casualties and trouble they had gone through at South Mountain would soon pale in comparison to the fighting on the 17th. It would prove to be the single bloodiest day of the American Civil War.